3 years. Elena Carter gave 3 years of her life to a man who never once asked how she was doing. Jackson Pierce built his empire on precision, control, and the quiet labor of people he never looked at twice. He gave orders. She executed them. That was the arrangement. That was her life. Until the morning he told her to miss her sister's wedding, and Elena Carter said no. If you've ever had to choose between who you work for and who you love, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. What? The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to, and Elena was already awake. She lay flat on her back in the dark of her studio apartment, staring at the ceiling with the kind of stillness that wasn't rest. It was endurance. The radiator knocked against the wall. A cab honked 8 floors below. Somewhere in the building, someone was already running a shower, already beginning the performance of being alive and functional and ready for the world. Elena reached over and killed the alarm before it could complete a single cycle. She had not slept more than 5 hours. She knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, without checking, without measuring, just knowing, because her body had learned to report its own deficits with quiet precision. She sat up, pressed both palms flat against the mattress, felt the cool edge of the fitted sheet under her fingers, and held onto that small sensation the way you hold onto something real when everything else feels like performance. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. That was how long she had worked for Jackson Pierce. She didn't count it deliberately. It was just there, the way some numbers are, carved into the mind without permission. The way you remember the exact date your life changed direction without meaning to memorize it. She stood, moved to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and stood under water that was slightly too hot because she needed to feel something before she could feel nothing for the next 12 hours. She pressed her forehead against the tile and breathed through the steam and gave herself exactly 90 seconds of that before she straightened, reached for her shampoo, and began. The apartment was small. One room that served as bedroom, living space, and dining area, a kitchen galley barely wide enough for 2 people to stand in side by side, and a bathroom with a shower head that leaked slightly at the base. The lease was $1,800 a month in a neighborhood that had been gentrifying for a decade without ever quite finishing the job. She could afford better. She hadn't had time to move. That was the thing about working for Jackson Pierce. You didn't have time for anything that wasn't him. She pressed her blouse and skirt with a travel iron balanced on the edge of her kitchen counter because her ironing board had a broken hinge she'd meant to fix for 7 months. She made coffee in a French press she'd bought at a going-out-of-business sale 3 years ago and drank it standing at the window, watching the city below move through its early gray light. The streets were wet from overnight rain. The buses moved like dark whales through shallow water. She thought about the meeting at 9, the call with Singapore at 11:30, the board document she'd reformatted at 2 in the morning because Jackson had sent her a message that said only, "These are wrong. Fix them." No specification, no details. Just the expectation that she would understand exactly what was wrong, correct it completely, and have the revised files waiting in his inbox before dawn. She had, because she always did. That was the arrangement. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and picked up her bag. Pierce Global Investments occupied the 42nd through 46th floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan that had no name anyone used casually. People said the Pierce Building the way they said the Met or the Bridge, as though it had always existed, as though it was a feature of the landscape rather than something one man had decided to build with money he'd made before he was 35. The lobby had marble floors that cost more per square foot than Elena's monthly rent. The security team wore charcoal uniforms with no visible badges because Jackson believed visible badges suggested a building that needed protection, and he did not want his investors thinking in terms of vulnerability. The elevator banks were paneled in dark walnut and moved with an uncanny smoothness that Elena still noticed after 3 years, the way good engineering makes gravity feel optional. She badged through at 6:52 a.m. Margot was already at the assistant pool desk, a fact that surprised no one who knew Margot, which was a woman in her mid-50s who treated punctuality like a moral position. She looked up when Elena passed and said, without preamble, "He's already in." Elena didn't break stride. "How long?" Car dropped him at 6:10. He went straight to the 46th, didn't stop at 43. Margot's voice was perfectly neutral, which meant she was working to keep it that way. 46 was the floor Jackson used when he wanted to be unavailable to almost everyone. It meant something was wrong, or something was being decided, or both. Did he ask for anything? Not yet. Thank you, Margot. She took the internal elevator to 43, her floor, and sat at her desk and opened the overnight queue. There were 64 emails requiring her action or attention, 14 marked urgent by various members of the executive team, and one from Jackson himself, sent at 4:17 a.m., marked with a single red flag in the subject line and no subject text. She opened it last. The Harrington acquisition documents need to be restructured before the 9 o'clock. Blackwell's team will be there. Have revised projections on slide 14 and the comparative analysis reordered to lead with domestic rather than international. Also, the catering for today's board breakfast is wrong. Fix it. Elena read it twice. Then she looked at the clock. It was 6:58 a.m. The 9 o'clock meeting was in 2 hours and 2 minutes. She opened the presentation file. Slide 14 was a dense, 3-part projection model that the finance team had taken 4 days to assemble. Reordering the comparative analysis meant rebuilding the data logic on slides 11 through 16, not just rearranging slides. The narrative architecture of the entire back half of the deck was structured around international expansion leading the case. Reversing it wasn't a cosmetic change. It was a reconstruction job. She called the overnight finance contact, a junior analyst named Peter who answered on the first ring because that was what overnight contacts learned to do when Elena Carter called before 7. I need you to send me the raw model files for the Harrington analysis, all of them. And I need the Blackwell comparison data in the original Excel format, not the formatted PDF. Right now? 11 minutes ago, Peter. She heard him typing already. She opened a second line and called the building's executive catering coordinator, whose name was Diane, and who answered with the resigned calm of someone who had fielded early morning corrections before. The 43rd board breakfast. What was ordered? Diane told her. Elena asked 2 questions, identified the problem. The dietary protocols for 2 board members had been switched in the system, a data entry error that would result in someone getting a breakfast that could hospitalize them, and had it corrected in under 4 minutes. She sent a confirmation to Diane, flagged the data entry issue for HR follow-up, and returned to her computer where Peter's files were already arriving. She worked without stopping for 90 minutes. At 8:49 a.m., she sent Jackson the revised presentation with a brief memo explaining every structural change, the logic behind each reordering decision, and a note that the catering error had been identified and corrected, with the HR flag number attached for reference. She also included a 1-paragraph brief on Richard Blackwell's known priorities based on his public statements and the 3 prior engagements Pierce Global had had with his team, which she included because Jackson hadn't asked for it, but would use it. At 8:51 a.m., her phone buzzed. A message from Jackson. Good. That was it. That was the whole thing. That was what 3 years of before-dawn reconstructions and corrected catastrophes and silent, invisible precision earned in the currency of Jackson Pierce's acknowledgement. Good. Elena set her phone face down on her desk and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed through her nose for a count of 4. Then she picked it up and moved to her next task. She did not see Jackson in person until 11:14 a.m., when he came through the 43rd floor in the particular way he moved through spaces, without adjusting himself to the room, without slowing, without looking at the people who moved aside for him the way water moves around stone. Jackson Pierce was 41 years old and looked it the way some men do, not aged, but constructed by time, pressed and hardened into a version of himself that didn't have the softness it once might have had. He was 6'2", lean in a way that looked like discipline rather than nature, with dark hair threaded lightly at the temples and eyes that were an unremarkable shade of gray-brown until you were in a room where he was looking at something he wanted, at which point they became very remarkable indeed. He dressed the way his offices were designed, expensive, minimal, precise, with no decorative gestures. He walked past her desk, slowed without stopping, and said, "The Singapore call. Move it to 1. It's already scheduled with 3 counterparties. Moving it means, I know what it means, move it." She moved it. She sent 3 emails, made one call, adjusted a calendar chain that affected 6 people's afternoons, and had confirmation of the rescheduled call in his inbox 7 minutes later. He didn't respond. At 12:30, she ate lunch at her desk. A container of leftover rice and vegetables she'd cooked on Sunday, which now felt like something that had happened in a previous era. She ate it cold because the microwave on 43 made food smell in a way that spread through the open office, and she'd learned not to be the source of smells. She read through the afternoon queue while she ate. She flagged 3 items for Jackson's attention, drafted 2 responses on his behalf in his voice, and began compiling the due diligence summary for the Thursday strategy session. At 1:47 p.m., she received a text from her sister. Elena, you confirmed for the rehearsal dinner Friday, right? Mom is asking me for head count. Please tell me you're still coming. Elena looked at the text for longer than it required. The rehearsal dinner was Friday evening. The wedding was Saturday. Sophie's wedding, which had been planned for 14 months. The event that had consumed her sister's entire emotional life for over a year and which Elena had promised, 3 times in plain language without qualification, she would be present for, including the role of maid of honor, which meant standing beside Sophie at the altar and giving a speech at the reception and being, for once, a person who showed up. She typed back, "Still coming. Tell Mom yes." She put the phone in her desk drawer because if she kept looking at it, she would feel things she could not afford to feel on a Tuesday afternoon with a Singapore call in 13 minutes. The Singapore call lasted 2 hours and 23 minutes instead of the scheduled 90 because the counterparty's legal team had issues with the indemnification clause that required live negotiation rather than offline drafting. Elena was on the call the entire time, off mute for 2 minutes when Jackson needed her to pull a specific clause from a prior contract and read it verbatim, the rest of the time silent and listening, building a live annotation of every point of contention and its proposed resolution, which she would have fully formatted before the call summary landed in Jackson's inbox. She sent it at 3:58 p.m. At 4:02 p.m., Jackson appeared at her desk, not the managed proximity of someone walking past. He stopped. He stood at the edge of her workspace in a way that communicated intention, and she looked up from her screen. "The Harrington Close is moving forward," he said. "Blackwell's team wants preliminary documents by Monday." Monday? She calculated without pausing. That's 4 business days, including today. The due diligence summary isn't complete. The legal team needs to sign off on the restructured acquisition terms, and the international projection models need external audit before we can... I know what needs to happen, Carter. I need it by Monday. She held his gaze. He had a habit, when he was pressing a deadline, of delivering it with a flatness that made it feel like physics rather than preference, like the deadline existed in nature rather than in his mouth, like arguing with him was arguing with gravity. "I'll have a timeline to you by end of day," she said. He nodded once and turned to leave. "Also," he said, without turning back, "I need you this weekend, Saturday and Sunday. The documentation workload is going to require the full team here." Elena's hands were still on her keyboard. The wedding was Saturday. She felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not like a rupture, but like the small, specific click of something that had been slightly out of alignment finally reaching the end of its tolerance. "This Saturday?" she said. "Yes, I have a prior commitment Saturday." He turned then, slow and complete, the way he moved when he was deciding something. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over 3 years. Not contempt exactly, not dismissal exactly, but a kind of absolute certainty that whatever she was about to say was a variable he could simply override. "Cancel it." "I can't cancel it." A beat. The kind of silence in an open office that people nearby feel without being able to explain why they feel it. "I'm not asking, Carter. I understand that." She kept her voice level. She was surprised by how level it was. She'd expected her voice to do something she didn't want it to do, shake or climb or contract, but it didn't. It just stayed at the same register, measured, clear, like a line drawn with a ruler. "My sister's wedding is Saturday. I am her maid of honor. I gave her that commitment before I took this role, and I have reconfirmed it twice in the past 6 months. I can work Friday evening, I can work Sunday morning, and I can work remotely if documentation needs to be reviewed, but I will not be in this office on Saturday." Jackson looked at her for a long moment. If the Harrington deal closes at a loss because you weren't here, he said, that's on you. The Harrington deal won't close at a loss because I'm gone one Saturday. You have a finance team, a legal team, and a strategy director. What you need from me on Saturday is administrative coordination, and I will set everything up so that any of 3 people can manage it in my absence. That's not the point. Then tell me what the point is. Another beat? He wasn't used to being asked that question. He was used to being the one who defined the point, the one who established the terms and expected everyone else to orient themselves accordingly. The point, he said with a precision that was almost surgical, is that your role here requires availability when the company requires it. That's the role you accepted. I accepted a role as your executive assistant, not your property. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't say it with any particular heat. She just said it, in the same register as everything else, as a statement of observed fact, the way you say the room is cold or the meeting starts at 9. Jackson Pierce went very still. It was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the stillness of concentration, of a man whose mind was moving so fast that his body had learned to compensate with calm. This was different. This was the stillness of someone encountering something they hadn't anticipated and hadn't cataloged and weren't sure what to do with. Around them, without looking up, 3 other people in the open office had stopped typing. If you are not here Saturday, Jackson said with a quiet that had weight in it, don't come back Monday. Elena looked at him. She understood the ultimatum. She understood it completely. Its shape, its intention, the assumption buried inside it that she would do what every person before her had done when confronted with the full gravitational force of Jackson Pierce's expectations. She would weigh the salary, the title, the stability, the fear, and she would fold. She had folded before. Not dramatically, not with visible capitulation, but in the 1,000 small ways that accumulate over 3 years. The weekends cut short, the dinners skipped, the phone calls with Sophie taken in bathroom stalls and ended too soon, the persistent low-grade erosion of a life outside the office that had been happening so gradually she'd barely registered it as loss. She registered it now. Something happened in her chest. Not a breaking, more like a settling, like sediment finally reaching the bottom. She reached down, opened her bottom desk drawer, removed her personal items with the quiet efficiency of someone who had not planned this moment, but was not surprised to find herself in it. Her phone charger, a small framed photo of her and Sophie taken at Sophie's graduation 5 years ago, a spare pair of flat shoes she kept for late nights, a lip balm, a travel umbrella. She placed them in her bag. She stood. Jackson hadn't moved. I'll have my badge and access card to building security by end of day, she said. HR will need to formally process the separation. I'm happy to be available by email this week to ensure a smooth transition, and I'll have a transition document on your desk by 8 tomorrow morning so that whoever you hire next has everything they need. She picked up her bag. Elena. He used her first name. He almost never used her first name. It came out differently than everything else he had said. Less structured, like something that had escaped the normal architecture of how he spoke. She paused. This is not what you want to do, he said. You're right, she said, but it's what I'm doing. She walked to the elevator. She did not look back. She pressed the button and stood in front of the doors and listened to the quiet hum of the mechanism and felt her own heartbeat, which was fast but not panicked. The heartbeat of someone who has stepped off a ledge and discovered, mid-air, that they are not as afraid of falling as they thought they were. The doors opened. She stepped in. The elevator deposited her in the lobby and she walked through it, past the marble floors and the charcoal uniformed security and the dark walnut panels and the uncanny smooth engineering of the whole impeccable machine, and out through the glass doors and onto the sidewalk. The city hit her immediately. Sound, smell, October air with the first real cold in it, the particular pressure of Midtown in the mid-afternoon when the lunch crowd is settled and the pre-rush is still gathering itself. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building that had held 11 to 12 hours of her daily existence for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and she breathed. She did not cry. She noted the urge and let it pass, the way you let a wave pass when you know the water is deep enough that you don't have to move. Just stand in it and let it go. She took out her phone and called Sophie. Her sister answered on the second ring with the slightly chaotic warmth of someone managing 14 wedding-related things simultaneously. Elle, everything okay? I'm coming to the rehearsal dinner Friday, Elena said. And the wedding, the whole thing. I'm coming. A pause. Then Sophie said, softer, what happened? I'll tell you Friday. She started walking. There was nowhere in particular to be, which was a sensation so foreign it felt like stepping into a room and finding the walls in different places than they were yesterday. I just wanted you to know I'm coming. Are you okay? Ask me Saturday, Elena said. I think by Saturday I will be. She ended the call and kept walking. Her bag was on her shoulder. Her shoes were wrong for walking long distances. The air was cold enough that she should have had a coat. She did not stop. She walked 16 blocks south without a destination, through the particular human noise of the city in the afternoon, past coffee shops and construction scaffolding and food carts, and a man arguing on a phone in a language she didn't recognize. She walked until the adrenaline in her system began to metabolize into something more like clarity, and the clarity into something more like exhaustion, and the exhaustion into something quiet and real beneath it. She thought about 3 years. She thought about the number of hours she had spent in that building. She ran the calculation with the same automatic precision she applied to everything and came up with a number large enough to embarrass her. Not because she had worked hard, she had no objection to working hard, but because of how completely the work had replaced everything else. She could not remember the last dinner she'd eaten at a table with another human being. She could not remember the last book she'd finished, the last movie she'd watched from beginning to end, the last Saturday she'd had that was just hers. She thought about Jackson's face when she'd said, "Not your property." The stillness. The way something had moved across his expression that she didn't have a name for but had noticed. She filed it and kept walking. At 6:23 p.m., her phone buzzed. An email notification from an address she didn't recognize. A personal email, not the Pierce Global domain. She opened it. It was from Jackson. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained 4 sentences. The Singapore call rescheduling caused a cascade problem with the Monday framework that Peterson's team can't resolve. The Harrington preliminary documents will miss the internal deadline without your coordination. I am aware of what I said this afternoon. I need you to come back. Elena read it 3 times standing in the middle of the sidewalk while people moved around her. She read it slowly with the same attention she gave documents that required precision, looking for every layer of what was actually being communicated beneath the surface of the words. 4 sentences from Jackson Pierce. 1 acknowledgement of his own words. 1 statement of operational need. No apology, no retraction, no question. Just, I need you to come back. She put the phone back in her bag. She started walking again. And somewhere on the 46th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, for the first time since he had built the company that bore his name, Jackson Pierce was sitting at his desk in an office that suddenly felt exactly as large as it was, looking at a screen that showed him 12 problems he could solve and 1 that he couldn't, and feeling, with a slow and unprecedented precision, the specific weight of a silence that was not going to fill itself. He had told her not to come back. He had told her that. He had watched her pick up her bag with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything, and he had watched her walk to the elevator, and he had said her name. Her first name, which he never used, which came out of him before he had decided to say it. And she had paused, and he had told her she didn't want to do this, and she had told him he was right, and she had done it anyway. He had fired people before. He had ended relationships, professional, personal, both, with the same clean, decisive severance he applied to everything else. He had never once looked back. He was looking back. He pulled up the analytics dashboard for the afternoon's operational chain and spent 45 minutes mapping every decision she had made in the past 18 hours. The catering air catch, the presentation reconstruction, the Singapore call management, the transition documentation she'd referenced without being asked, the integration of information across 5 departments that no single system tracked, but that she held entirely in her head. It was like trying to trace the load-bearing walls of a building by looking at where it was beginning to lean. He put his hands flat on the desk. The office was quiet. The city moved below the glass 46 floors down, indifferent and continuous. He typed the email. 4 sentences. He read them once and sent it before he could decide not to. Then he sat back in his chair and waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. He only knew that whatever it was, he was not in control of its timing, and that this fact, simple and total, was unlike anything he had experienced since the company was 3 people and a leased office, and he had not yet learned to make himself unassailable. He was not unassailable. She had walked away, and he had felt it immediately, and he was still feeling it, and that was the truth. The only currency Elena Carter had ever demanded of him that he had no system for producing. His phone sat on the desk. The screen stayed dark. She didn't respond that night. She didn't respond the next morning. She went to her sister's rehearsal dinner on Friday evening, and she stood at the front of the restaurant with a glass of champagne in her hand and gave a toast that made Sophie cry and made their mother laugh and made the groom, a patient and decent man named David, squeeze Sophie's shoulder with the particular tenderness of someone who had been trusted with something precious and knew it. And somewhere across the city, in a glass tower that was beginning very quietly to understand its own structural dependencies, things were breaking. Not catastrophically. Not yet. Just enough to make visible what had always been true. That the whole elegant machine had been running for 3 years on something it had never bothered to name. Until it was gone. Saturday morning, Elena Carter stood in a hotel room in a bridesmaid dress the color of deep sage, while her sister sat in front of a vanity mirror, and for the first time in 3 years, she had nowhere to be but here. No cue, no call, no message marked urgent, just Sophie's reflection in the mirror and the sound of someone outside the window starting too early, and the particular light of a Saturday in October that felt like something she'd been waiting to see for longer than she could account for. Her phone was on the nightstand. It had been there since Friday. There were 11 messages in total from the Pierce Global Domain. 3 from Peterson, 2 from the head of legal, 1 from the director of strategy, 4 from an address she didn't recognize that resolved, when she looked closely, to a secondary email Jackson had apparently created sometime in the past 36 hours. She had read none of them. She would read them after the wedding, after the reception, after Sophie and David danced their first dance and the cake was cut and the guests drifted into the mild chaos of a good party winding down. After. For now, she reached up and pinned the last piece of Sophie's veil with steady hands and met her sister's eyes in the mirror and said, "You look like everything you ever wanted." Sophie laughed through the start of tears. "Don't make me cry right now. You're going to cry in about 40 minutes anyway." "I know, I need 40 minutes. Elena smiled. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always did, without her, without Jackson, without any of it, and she breathed all the way down to the bottom of her lungs for what felt like the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She did not know yet that when she came back to her phone after the reception, she would find a message unlike anything Jackson Pierce had ever sent anyone in his professional life. She did not know yet what it would say. She did not know yet what she would do. But the day was here. Sophie was crying anyway. David was already waiting at the end of the aisle. And whatever was coming, whatever restructuring of everything she had believed about her life and her limits and the distance between duty and want, it could wait exactly as long as this moment lasted. She offered Sophie her hand, and they walked out together. The message was waiting for her at 11:47 p.m. Elena saw it when she finally picked up her phone in the back of the cab, shoes off, feet pulled up beneath her, the city sliding past the rain-streaked window in long amber smears. The reception had run 4 hours. She had danced twice, once with Sophie, once with a groomsman named Marcus, who was kind and slightly drunk and kept apologizing for stepping on her foot, which he did 3 times. She had given her speech and gotten through it without crying, which she considered a personal achievement. She had eaten actual food at an actual table with actual people who asked her questions about her life that had nothing to do with deliverables or timelines, and she had answered them, and it had felt strange and necessary in equal measure, like using a muscle that had atrophied without her noticing. Sophie had cried during the first dance. Elena had watched from the side of the floor with a glass of wine and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy, but lived in the territory between them. The feeling of witnessing something real. Now she was in a cab at midnight, with her heels in her lap and her phone in her hand, and the message on the screen was from Jackson's secondary email, the one he'd apparently created in the past 36 hours, which told her something about the state of things without requiring any additional information. The subject line said, "I need to speak with you, not about the company." She read it twice, looked out the window, looked back at the phone. She did not respond. She paid the cab, went upstairs, took off the sage-colored dress and hung it on the back of the bathroom door and stood in the shower until the water went cold, which took longer than usual because she was not tracking the time. She put on a worn t-shirt and an old pair of sweatpants and got into bed and stared at the ceiling. She slept 7 hours without interruption, which was the longest she had slept in 2 years. When she woke Sunday morning, there were 3 more messages. Psst. The first 2 were from Peterson, the strategy director, a nervous and competent man who had always treated Elena with the particular deference of someone who understood exactly how much invisible work she was doing and was grateful for it in a way he never quite said out loud. His messages were professional and carefully worded and communicated, without stating it plainly, that the 43rd floor was in a quiet state of operational crisis. The Harrington preliminary documents were stalled. The Singapore counterparty had sent a follow-up that required immediate response. 2 internal meetings had been scheduled without anyone realizing they conflicted with commitments already on the calendar, and no one could locate the master scheduling matrix because it lived in Elena's system, formatted by Elena, annotated by Elena, and accessible to everyone in theory and to no one in practice. The third message was from Jackson. It contained 1 sentence. "Please call me." Elena sat with the phone in both hands and read that sentence with the same methodical attention she gave everything, looking for its components. The word "please," which Jackson Pierce had likely typed with the same discomfort most people reserve for public speaking or medical procedures. The word "call," which meant voice, which meant he wanted her to hear him, not read him, which meant something he was not putting in writing. And the period at the end, which was doing a lot of structural work in a sentence of 4 words. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. She made coffee. She drank it at the window. She watched the Sunday city below, which moved at a different speed than the weekday city. Looser, intermittent, with longer gaps between cabs. A couple walked a dog below. A man in a yellow jacket was unlocking a bodega across the street. The light was flat and gray and Sunday-colored. At 9:15 a.m., she picked up the phone and called. He answered before the end of the first ring. "Elena, you said to call." A pause. She heard him exhale. Short, controlled, the breath of someone managing something. "Where are you?" "Home." "Are you? How was the wedding?" She waited a moment. "Jackson, if you want to talk about the company, talk about the company." "I don't want to talk about the company." "Then what do you want to talk about?" Longer pause. She heard the ambient sound of wherever he was. Quiet, interior, the low hum of a high-floor building. 46, probably. She wondered if he'd left at all this weekend. "I've been going through the operational chain," he said, "since Thursday, mapping what you managed." "I know." Peterson's messages were informative. "I'm not calling about Peterson." His voice had a texture she didn't recognize in it. Not the stripped-down efficiency of every professional interaction they'd ever had, and not the cold pressure of the ultimatum, but something rougher, less processed. "I'm calling because I need to tell you something that has nothing to do with deliverables or scheduling or the Harrington deal." "All right, I was wrong." He said it the way someone drives a nail, direct, single impact, no preamble. "What I asked you to do was wrong. The ultimatum was wrong. How I've run that office and what I've expected from you. I'm not going to dress it up. It was wrong." Elena was quiet. "I'm not saying this to get you back," he continued, though the way he said it suggested he was aware of exactly how it could be read. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I've been sitting in this building since Thursday night, and I keep thinking about what you said." "Which part?" "All of it." A beat. "Particularly the part about property." She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead, looked at the ceiling, breathed. "Jackson, I know. 3 years. I know. Not one time in 3 years did you ask me if I was okay. Not when I worked 36 hours straight on the Hong Kong restructure. Not when my father was in the hospital in March, and I still had the quarterly reports on your desk by 8 a.m. Not once." Silence. "I know," he said. And it was the 3rd time he'd said those 2 words, and each time they'd had slightly more weight, like something accumulating. She pressed her lips together. The morning light through the window was doing something specific to the dust particles in the air, and she watched them move. "What is it you actually want from this call?" she said. "I want to offer you something different." She heard him shift, the small sound of someone repositioning, standing, moving toward a window maybe, the way he did when he was thinking hard. Chief of Staff, real authority, not assistant authority, operational authority. You would have direct oversight of every departmental director. Your own office on 45, equity in the company, saw it, not a token amount. Something real. And personally? A pause. That's your boundary to set, not mine. She turned that over. It was the right answer. It was the answer she would have told him to give if he'd asked her how to handle this conversation, which was a strange thing to notice. "I need time to think," she said. "Take it. I'm not promising anything." "I understand." She ended the call, stood at the window for a long time. Then she went and sat at her kitchen table with a blank notepad and a pen and wrote, in 2 columns, everything she stood to lose and everything she stood to gain, and stared at both columns for 40 minutes and then turned the page over and wrote a single question in the middle of it. "Who are you outside of that building?" She stared at the question for a long time. She didn't answer it yet. She went back on a Wednesday. She did not announce it in advance. She arrived at 7:30 a.m., badged through with her original credentials, which Jackson had apparently not deactivated, and took the elevator to 45, not 43, where she'd spent 3 years, and found an office that had been cleared and furnished with evident speed. A desk, a chair, a monitor, a phone, a small table with 2 chairs for meetings, and on the desk, a single printed card with her name on it, and the title Chief of Staff, Pierce Global Investments. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went in, put her bag down, sat in the chair, and turned on the monitor. By 8:15 a.m., she had identified 6 immediate operational problems, drafted a resolution framework for 3 of them, and sent a meeting request to all 4 departmental directors for 10 a.m. At 8:47 a.m., Jackson appeared in the doorway of her new office. He was wearing a dark jacket, open collar, the small adjustment of someone who had slightly loosened something about themselves or was trying to. He looked at her at her desk the way someone looks at an image they've been holding in their mind to check if it's accurate. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said. "I'm here," she said. "That's what matters." He almost smiled. It didn't complete itself, but it moved in that direction. "Ground rules," she said without looking up from her screen. "Go ahead." "My schedule is mine. If I say I'm unavailable, I'm unavailable. You don't override it. You don't work around it. You don't send messages at 4 a.m. and expect responses before 6. If the building is burning down, you call me. For everything else, there are systems." "Agreed. If you disagree with the decision I make at the operational level, you tell me directly. You don't go around me to the directors. That's the fastest way to make this not work." "Agreed. And I work here as a professional. What happened before, the way you ran that office, what you expected, what you took, that's not something I'm forgiving this week. It's not something I'm forgiving this month. I'm here because the role is right and because I'm good at it, not because we've resolved anything personal." He held her gaze. His hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, which was unusual. He habitually put his hands in his pockets when he was managing something he didn't want to show. Right now, his hands were just at his sides, visible, and he was looking at her without the processed stillness she was used to. "Understood," he said. "Good." She looked back at her screen. "I have a director's meeting at 10. You should be there." He left without another word. She exhaled once, quietly, through her nose. Then she went back to work. The first 2 weeks were frictionless in the way that things are frictionless when everyone is being careful. The departmental directors received her with the calibrated deference of people who had spent the previous week watching everything slightly fail without her and were not prepared to make the same mistake twice. Peterson was visibly relieved. The head of legal, a woman named Hargrove who had a reputation for being difficult, came to Elena's office on the 4th day, sat down without being invited, and said, "Tell me what you need from my team, and I'll make sure you have it." Elena had told her. Hargrove had left and done exactly that. Jackson was different. Not completely. He still moved through spaces the same way, like he owned them, because he did. He still had the clipped precision of someone for whom most conversations were information transfers rather than interactions. He still sent messages at hours that suggested he did not sleep the way other people slept. But he listened differently. He had always listened in meetings in the sense that he processed what was said and extracted what was relevant. But now he listened in a way that included the person speaking. He asked follow-up questions that were not about information, but about the person's actual position. He let people finish. Twice Elena watched him disagree with something a director said, and instead of overriding them, he said, "Walk me through your reasoning." Both times, the director had given a reason Jackson hadn't considered, and both times he had incorporated it without comment. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, cataloged them without yet knowing what to do with them. She maintained the formal distance she had promised herself. She was professional, direct, efficient. She did not linger after meetings. She did not accept the coffee he sent to her office without explanation on 3 separate mornings, which she returned via Margot with a brief note. Maintaining professional boundaries. "Thank you anyway." He sent a message in response that said, "The coffee was from the kitchen. I didn't make it for you. The kitchen made it." She looked at that message for a full minute. She did not respond, but she kept the next one. Bam. Nathan Cole arrived on the 3rd week. He came through the door of a quarterly strategy meeting as though he had always been there. Introduced by Jackson as the new vice president of international expansion, brought in with a 3-year mandate to develop Pierce Global's Asia-Pacific and European portfolios. He was 38, with the particular physical ease of someone who had grown up comfortable and never been required to make himself smaller in any room. He had brown hair, a specific kind of non-threatening handsomeness, and eyes that registered people with what appeared to be genuine interest. He sat across the table from Elena at the strategy meeting and listened to her present the operational restructuring plan for Q4 with the attentiveness of someone who was actually thinking about what she was saying, not waiting for his turn. When she finished, he said, "The cascade trigger on page 7. If the Singapore timeline shifts again, is there a manual override built into the protocol, or does the whole chain have to be reinitiated?" Elena looked at him. It was the right question. It was, in fact, the one vulnerability in the system she hadn't fully addressed yet, and it was not a simple thing to spot. "I'm building one," she said. "It's not in this draft." "Okay." He nodded, wrote something on the document in front of him, and moved on. She noted that, filed it. After the meeting, he found her in the corridor. "Elena Carter," he said. Not a question, just a statement, like he was confirming something he'd already considered. "I did some reading before I started. Your name came up, specifically your work on the Hong Kong restructure and the Singapore protocol. The frameworks you built apparently became the internal standard that nobody bothered to update the documentation for." "That's accurate," she said. "You built those frameworks as an assistant?" "I built them because they needed to exist. The title was whatever it was." He studied her for a moment. "I'd like to pick your brain on the Asia-Pacific approach. Properly. Not in a meeting where everyone's performing, just a working conversation." "I'll check my calendar," she said. She checked her calendar. She blocked Tuesday at noon. She sent him a confirmation. That evening she stayed late, not for Jackson, but because she was refining the cascade protocol Nathan had flagged, which was a real gap and needed closing. She was at her desk at 7:30 when Jackson appeared in her doorway. He looked at the screen, at the document she had open. "Cole's question," he said. "It was a good one." Jackson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in it, very slightly, somewhere around the eyes. "How did the meeting read to you? Generally?" "He's smart," she said. "He pays attention. He asks questions that are actually about the answer." "And?" She looked at him. "And what?" "You're going to tell me there's a qualifier." "I always wait before making qualifiers. I've known him 4 hours." Jackson nodded. He stayed in the doorway one moment longer than the conversation required. Then, "Don't stay too late." It was the first time in 3 years he had ever said that to her. She watched him go. Then she turned back to her screen and worked for another 90 minutes and did not think about what that meant until she was in the elevator going down, at which point she thought about it for approximately half a second before deciding that thinking about it was not a productive use of the elevator ride, and stopped. Tuesday lunch with Nathan was direct and useful in the way that conversations with genuinely intelligent people tend to be. Without social friction, without the exhausting machinery of impression management, just two people looking at a problem from different angles. He had strong opinions and held them clearly without needing her to agree with them. He pushed back when he disagreed. He laughed once, unexpectedly, at something she said that she hadn't intended to be funny, and it was the specific laugh of someone caught off guard rather than performing warmth. She found herself talking for 4 minutes without monitoring what she was saying, which almost never happened. Walking back to the elevator, he said, "Same time next week?" "If the calendar allows," she said. "The calendar will allow," he said, with the mild confidence of someone who was not wrong about this, "if you want it to." She looked at him. "Tuesday works," she said. He nodded and went toward his office, and she went toward hers. And that was the whole of it. But by the time she reached her desk, she had already registered that the interaction was visible. The Pierce Global 45th floor had the spatial openness of an office that believed in transparency, which meant that 6 people had watched them walk back from lunch, and 5 of those 6 were now doing their own quiet math. She did not change anything about her behavior, but she was aware of it. Jackson was also aware of it. He did not say anything directly. He was too controlled for direct. But there were small signals. A meeting request for Tuesday at noon, sent to Elena without explanation, which conflicted with the lunch. She moved the lunch to Thursday. Jackson's Tuesday meeting request contained agenda items that could have been handled by email. She sat through it and said nothing. Thursday lunch, same building cafeteria. Nathan ordered coffee, she ordered tea. They argued productively about the risk weighting in the European expansion model for 90 minutes, and she returned to her office feeling the specific, clean tiredness of a conversation that had required her full attention. She was crossing the open floor toward her office when she saw Jackson at the far end of the room, standing outside Peterson's office, not looking at her, looking at his phone. But she had worked within his peripheral awareness for 3 years. She knew the difference between looking at a phone and using a phone as something to look at while you looked at something else. She went to her desk and sat down and opened her work queue and did not acknowledge it. That evening at 6:14 p.m., Jackson came to her office and stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, "How much do you know about Cole's background, his prior firms?" Elena looked up. "He came recommended by Hartfield Capital. 12 years of international expansion work, clean record, 2 successful portfolio builds. You hired him." "I know I hired him." "Then what's the question?" Jackson was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing where he was deciding how much of what he was actually thinking to say, which she could read because she had watched him do it approximately 10,000 times. "Just stay observant," he said finally. "With him." Elena set down her pen. "Jackson, if you have a specific concern about Nathan Cole, tell me what it is. Don't give me ambient instructions to be observant without context. I'm not your intelligence asset." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not the usual processed stillness, but something rawer. Something that sat just below the surface and was visibly costing him effort to not say. "I don't have a specific concern," he said. "Not yet." "Then I'd appreciate it if you let me do my job without interference shaped by anything other than actual operational information." He held her gaze. "Understood." He left. She stared at the empty doorway for a moment. "Not yet," he had said. She had been in the room with Jackson Pierce for 3 years, 2 months, and however many additional days since she'd walked back through the doors of this building. She knew his calibrations. She knew the difference between professional caution and something else. Not yet was not professional caution. She logged the observation, returned to her work, and did not yet understand that the thing Jackson Pierce was feeling, the thing he had precisely no framework for and even less ability to name, had already begun to change the chemistry of the floor they shared, molecule by molecule, in ways that none of them could see yet, but all of them were going to feel. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening when the floor was almost empty and the city below had gone to its night register, Nathan Cole stopped in the doorway of her office and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" She looked up. "Depends on the question," she said. He leaned against the door frame, crossed his arms, looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him. "Is there something between you and Pierce?" he asked. "I'm not asking to cause problems. I'm asking because the room feels different when you're both in it, and I'd rather know what I'm navigating. Elena held the question. She was aware of her own heartbeat. No, she said. There's nothing between us. Nathan nodded slowly. All right. He pushed off the doorframe. Then I'd like to take you to dinner. Not a work conversation, just dinner. The hallway behind him was quiet. The floor was quiet. From somewhere down the corridor came the faint sound of the cleaning crew beginning their rounds. Elena looked at Nathan Cole, his directness, his patience, the uncomplicated quality of his interest in her, which was so different from anything she'd experienced in this building that it felt almost foreign. And then she heard, from the far end of the hall, the unmistakable sound of a specific footstep, Jackson's footstep. She knew it the way you know a sound you've heard 1,000 times in confined spaces. She looked past Nathan's shoulder. Jackson had appeared at the far end of the corridor, coming from the stairwell, and he had stopped. He was looking at them. Nathan in her doorway. Elena at her desk. The specific geometry of the scene. Nathan turned, registered Jackson, and straightened without urgency. The three of them existed in that corridor for approximately 3 seconds. Then Jackson said, "Cole, I need 5 minutes, my office." His voice was its usual register, controlled, directive. But Elena heard what was underneath it with the clarity of 3 years of proximity. Nathan glanced at Elena. "Tomorrow night," he said quietly. "If you want." He walked toward Jackson's office. Jackson looked at Elena one more moment, just a moment. Then he followed. Elena sat very still at her desk. The monitor in front of her glowed in the dim office. The cleaning crew's cart rattled somewhere down the hall. She thought about what she'd said to Nathan. There's nothing between us. She thought about whether that was the truth or whether it was the truth as she currently needed it to be, which were two different things she had been carefully not distinguishing. She thought about Jackson's face in that corridor. The stillness that was not processing, but something older and less managed. She put both hands flat on her desk. Tomorrow, she would answer Nathan. She would decide based on what she actually felt, not based on the geometry of a corridor at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. She would be a person who made choices based on her own life, not based on the invisible gravitational field of a man who had spent 3 years not seeing her and was only now learning what the absence of her felt like. She would decide tomorrow. She reached for her phone to shut down for the night and found a message already waiting, sent 4 minutes ago, while Jackson was walking Nathan toward his office. It was from Jackson. It said, "I need to tell you something, not professionally. I've been trying to find the right time, and I understand if there isn't one. But I need you to know that what I feel..." The message cut off there, mid-sentence, as though he had sent it before he meant to, or before he was finished, or in the one unguarded moment he'd had in 41 years of keeping everything precisely where he put it. Elena stared at the truncated sentence. The cleaning cart rattled past her doorway. The monitor hummed. The city moved below, indifferent and continuous. She read the half-sentence 4 more times, and her hand, which had been reaching for the shutdown button, went very still. She read it 7 times. Not because the words were complicated. The words were not complicated. They were 11 words in a fragment, the unfinished edge of something that had apparently escaped the containment of a man who spent his entire professional life deciding exactly what to release and what to keep. But she read it 7 times because each reading produced a slightly different understanding of what she was holding, and she needed to be sure she was holding the right thing before she decided what to do with it. What I feel... She put the phone face down on the desk. She stood up, walked to the window. The city below was doing what the city did at 7:30 on a Thursday. Moving, indifferent, continuous. 11 million people arranging themselves through space with no particular awareness that on the 45th floor of a glass tower above them, a woman was standing at a window trying to determine whether she was about to make the most significant mistake of her adult life or correct one. She picked the phone back up, read it once more. Then she typed, "Finish the sentence." She sent it before she could decide not to. Immediately, the way you pull a bandage, not because it hurts less, but because the anticipation is its own specific damage, and she was done with anticipation. She watched the screen. 3 minutes passed. The typing indicator appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again, then stopped. Then, "Not tonight. Can we talk tomorrow?" She looked at that. "Yes," she typed. "Tomorrow." She shut down her monitor. She picked up her bag. She left the building without passing 46 and did not let herself think about what was happening on that floor. If anything, if he was sitting at his desk with the phone in his hand the way she had been sitting at hers, doing the same calculus she was doing, arriving at the same terrifying conclusion or a different one. She went home. She did not sleep well. She woke at 5:12 and lay in the dark and listened to the radiator knock. Tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived with a 6:47 a.m. message from Peterson that had nothing to do with tomorrow and everything to do with right now. Elena, I don't want to alarm you, but the Blackwell team called at 6 a.m. They're initiating a formal audit of the international expansion accounts. Full scope. They want access to documentation by end of week. I flagged it for Jackson, but I think you should know before the 9 o'clock. She read it on her phone before getting out of bed. Read it again. Then she got up, made coffee, and was at her desk on 45 by 7:15. The 9 o'clock was not a 9 o'clock. It was a controlled emergency with the architecture of a meeting placed over it to manage how it looked. Jackson was already in the conference room when she arrived, standing at the window with his back to the table, jacket on, which meant he'd either come in at dawn or not left. Peterson was there. Hargrove from legal. The CFO, a man named Birch, who had the specific pallor of someone who had received bad news and was attempting to metabolize it through professionalism. Nathan Cole was not there. Elena noted his absence, filed it. Richard Blackwell's team called at 6 a.m., Jackson said, without turning from the window. They're alleging irregularities in the international expansion accounts. They're not specific yet about which accounts or which period, which means they either don't know exactly what they have or they're controlling how much they show us before they show us everything. What kind of irregularities? Elena said. Jackson turned. He looked at her with the particular directness of someone who has been awake long enough that the managed distance has worn thin. Invoice manipulation, potentially altered transaction records in the Asia-Pacific preliminary accounts. Birch said, the preliminary accounts are new. They were set up in the past 8 weeks. Elena processed that. The Asia-Pacific accounts were Nathan Cole's first mandate. The room was quiet for a moment. Yes, Jackson said. That's a fact, not an accusation, she said. I want to be clear about that distinction before this conversation goes any further. Noted, Jackson said. His voice had the flatness of someone maintaining control of a room that was trying to tip. Hargrove, what's our exposure if the audit finds what Blackwell's team is suggesting? Hargrove was already 3 steps into her answer. Potential regulatory notification, external counsel engagement, the specific liability framework for fraudulent transaction records if they were traced to a Pierce Global account holder. Elena listened and took notes, and tracked each piece as it connected to the architecture she already understood, and what she understood was this. If someone had manipulated invoice records and altered transaction logs in the Asia-Pacific preliminary accounts, they had done it with a level of access that required executive clearance. The number of people with that clearance was small. Nathan Cole had it. He'd had it from day one as a condition of the VP mandate. I need access to the account logs, Elena said. The originals, not the formatted versions. And I need the metadata, timestamps, access records, modification history. Birch looked at Jackson. Give her everything she needs, Jackson said. She worked through the day with the focused quiet of someone diffusing something that would not wait. Peterson brought her files. Birch sent her system access. Hargrove gave her a direct line to external counsel and told her to use it if she found anything that required immediate legal containment. At 2:14 p.m., Nathan knocked on her open office door. She looked up. He was composed. Clean-pressed jacket, the unremarkable handsomeness, the easy posture. Nothing in his face suggested crisis awareness. You missed the morning meeting, she said. I had a call with the Singapore counterparty. From 6 to 9? A small pause. It ran long. She held his gaze. Jackson's going to want to talk to you this afternoon about the Asia-Pacific accounts. Something moved across his face. Not panic, something smaller and more controlled, like the brief adjustment of a person who was expecting a conversation and had prepared for it. I heard about the Blackwell audit. From who? Word travels. Not that fast, she said. The meeting was closed. Who told you? He looked at her for a moment. Then, does it matter? Everything matters right now, Nathan. He studied her. The easy posture was still there, but there was a quality under it now. A watchfulness she had noticed before. In the Tuesday lunches, in the way he asked questions. That she was recontextualizing in real time, with the cold, methodical discomfort of someone adjusting a lens and not liking what comes into focus. "I'll talk to Jackson," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." He left. She turned back to her screen and noted the time, 2:17 p.m., and the exact words of the exchange, and the fact that he had not answered the question of who had told him, and the fact that he had known to phrase his response in a way that didn't constitute a lie, but didn't constitute an answer. She pulled up the account access logs and started building a timeline. At 4:30 p.m., she found the first gap. It was small, a 4-minute window on a Wednesday, 3 weeks prior, where the modification log for invoice batch 7C showed a timestamp of activity, but no associated user credential. In a properly functioning system, every access event generated a credential signature. 4 minutes of activity without a credential meant one of 3 things: a system error, a logging failure, or someone who knew how to operate within the system at a level that bypassed standard credentialing. She flagged it, kept building. At 5:51 p.m., she found the second gap. Same pattern. Different invoice batch. Different Wednesday. 4 weeks prior. She sat back in her chair and looked at the 2 flagged entries and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years building administrative systems and therefore knew exactly how they failed and exactly how they could be made to fail deliberately, that what she was looking at was not a system error and not a logging failure. Someone had been in these records. Someone had modified invoice data without leaving a credential trail, which required either a system-level access that bypassed standard audit logging or deliberate alteration of the logging protocol itself. She pulled the system architecture documentation, cross-referenced it with the access permission matrix from Nathan's onboarding, found what she was looking for in 40 seconds. Nathan Cole's VP authorization included something called Administrative Override Access, granted as a routine component of executive packages. In theory, it was for emergency operational situations. In practice, it gave him the ability to operate within the financial systems at a level that generated a different class of log entry, one that, if the logging protocol itself was adjusted, could be rendered invisible to standard audit queries. The logging protocol had been adjusted 6 weeks ago. The adjustment was filed under routine system maintenance. She looked at who had authorized the maintenance request. The authorization signature was Nathan Cole's. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Jackson. He answered immediately. "What did you find?" "I need you in my office, now, and I need you to come alone." He was there in 4 minutes. He closed the door behind him, which he had never done before in her office, and stood on the other side of her desk and looked at what she had on the screen with the expression of a man receiving information he had already begun to suspect, but had not wanted to be right about. She walked him through it. The gaps, the credential voids, the administrative override access, the logging protocol adjustment, the authorization signature. Jackson stood very still through all of it. His hands were in his pockets now. The tell, the one she'd cataloged, the sign that he was managing something significant. When she finished, he said, "How certain are you?" "I'm certain about what the records show. The interpretation requires confirmation. We'd need forensic analysis of the system adjustment logs and external verification of the invoice alterations before we could establish intent." "But your read?" "My read is that someone with Nathan's access, Nathan's system knowledge, and Nathan's authorization altered invoice records in the Asia-Pacific accounts in a way that was designed to survive a standard internal audit, but not a deep forensic one, and that the Blackwell audit is deep forensic." Jackson looked at the screen. The city outside the window was going to its early evening arrangement, lights coming on in layers, floor by floor across the buildings. "Why?" he said. It wasn't a question shaped like a question. It was the word a person says when they're trying to understand something that doesn't yet fit any framework they have. "I don't know yet," she said. "The financial motive I can map. Altered invoices can reroute funds, create false liability, manipulate valuation in ways that benefit a short position or a competing acquisition. but I need more of the records before I can tell you where the money went or who benefits." He was quiet. "Jackson." She waited until he looked at her. "I know what you're thinking. Don't decide anything tonight based on what you feel right now. The evidence needs to be complete before anything moves. If we act on partial information and we're wrong, or if there's a layer we haven't found yet, we give him the ability to claim we've targeted him without cause." His jaw was tight. "I'm not wrong. You might not be. But the difference between being right and being able to prove it is the only thing that matters right now." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, the frustration of a man who was constitutionally unsuited to restraint and was being asked to practice it anyway. "How long do you need?" "Give me 48 hours with full system access and external forensic support. Hargrove can engage the cyber team through outside counsel, so it's privileged." He nodded once. "I'll have Hargrove set it up tonight." He moved toward the door, stopped, his hand on the frame, his back to her. "The dinner he asked you to, did you? That's not relevant to this." "Elena, it is not relevant to this, Jackson." Her voice was flat and clear and precise. "If you want me to do this job properly, you have to let me do it without interference from anything else. That's what I told you when I came back. That's the condition." He turned, looked at her across the office. The distance between them was approximately 10 feet and approximately 3 years and approximately 11 words of an unsent sentence, all of which existed simultaneously and none of which either of them had the current bandwidth to address. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours, she confirmed. He left. She heard his footsteps recede down the corridor toward the elevator upward. She turned back to her screen. She worked until 11 p.m. She built a secondary timeline, cross-referencing the invoice modification dates against Nathan's calendar entries, his building access logs, his system login history. 3 of the 4 modification windows corresponded to evenings when Nathan had stayed late in the building. The 4th corresponded to a Saturday morning 3 weeks ago, a Saturday when Elena had not been in the building, when Jackson had been at an external investor meeting, and when the 45th floor had been operated by a skeleton crew. She stared at the Saturday entry for a long time. She pulled the building access logs for that Saturday. Nathan had badged in at 8:14 a.m., badged out at 1:47 p.m. She cross-referenced the invoice modification timestamp. It had occurred at 10:23 a.m. She leaned forward. She felt the specific cold focus of someone who has found the thread and is pulling it. Not with excitement, with the careful, controlled attention of someone who knows what unravels if you pull too hard. She followed the invoice batch modification back to its destination. The invoice in question was a contractor payment for an Asia-Pacific market research firm, a real firm, legitimately contracted, with a real payment amount. But the modified version had the payment routed to a different account than the one on the original contract. A small difference, 18 digits in a routing number, that would survive a cursory review but divert the funds entirely. She traced the destination account. It took her 22 minutes and 3 separate database queries, each of which required a level of access that Birch had authorized that afternoon. The destination account was registered to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. The holding company had been incorporated 14 months ago. She queried the company registration data. The registered agent was listed as a law firm she didn't recognize. The beneficial ownership was obscured behind 2 shell layers, standard for Cayman structures, which meant it would require legal process to penetrate fully. But the company had a name. It was called CCE Holdings. She sat back. CCE. 3 letters. She looked at them, ran through every acronym in the Pierce global corporate family, every counterparty she had managed correspondence with in 3 years. Nothing. Then she opened Nathan Cole's personnel file, the one HR had given her during onboarding, which she had read once and filed and not returned to. His full name was Nathan Christopher Cole. NCC. She stared at the screen. CCE Holdings. Cole Christopher Enterprises. Or Cole Christopher. Something. The inversion was deliberate, the kind of deliberate that was designed to fail a quick name search while remaining recoverable if you already knew what you were looking for. She pressed 2 fingers hard against the center of her forehead and held them there for a count of 5. Then she picked up her phone. It was 11:34 p.m. She called Jackson. He answered on the first ring. I found the destination account, she said. It's a Cayman holding company, 14 months old. She paused. It was incorporated 1 month before Nathan Cole applied for the VP position at Pierce Global. Silence on the line. The specific, dense silence of someone receiving information and doing what Jackson did with information. Processing it completely, mapping every implication, arriving at the conclusion before she'd finished saying it. He came here for this, Jackson said. His voice was very quiet. Not the controlled quiet of professional management, the quiet of something colder. That's what the evidence suggests. He didn't come to build the Asia-Pacific portfolio. He came to dismantle yours. The expansion mandate was the access vehicle. Another silence. Longer. The Blackwell audit, Jackson said. Yes. Blackwell didn't find this independently. She had been waiting for him to get there. No, she said. A random audit doesn't land on 8-week-old accounts with this precision. Someone pointed them at it. Nathan pointed them at it. That's my read. He built the irregularities, then triggered the audit to surface them in a way that looks like external discovery. Pierce Global takes the reputational hit, the regulatory exposure, potentially the criminal liability, and he walks away clean because his fingerprints are 1 layer down. She heard him breathing, slow and controlled and costing him something. Can you prove it? He said. Not tonight. I have the destination account, the modification pattern, and the CCE naming structure. I don't have the ownership chain through the shells. That requires legal process. Probably 2 to 3 days with the right forensic team. Hargrove will have people there at 7 a.m. Jackson. She hesitated. You can't move on Nathan before the chain is complete. If he has any warning, I know. He has to come in tomorrow. He has to sit in that building and act normal for 48 hours while we finish building the case. If he senses anything, I said, I know, Elena. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, just slightly, just enough. I understand what's required. I'll manage it. She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him. 48 hours ago, she wasn't sure she would have. But something had shifted in the past weeks, in the way he took her lead in the conference room, in the way he said, don't stay too late, in the way he had sent an 11-word sentence in a fragment at 7:30 on a Thursday evening and then couldn't finish it. She believed he would hold. Get some sleep, she said. You too. She ended the call. She sat in the dark office for a moment. The monitor glowed. The building was almost entirely quiet. The cleaning crew had been and gone. The city below moved at its nighttime frequency, lower and slower and continuous. She thought about Nathan Cole at Tuesday lunch, asking about the cascade trigger on page 7. The right question. She had thought it was the right question because he was smart. She had not considered that it might be the right question because he had already read the system documentation and knew exactly where the vulnerability was, because he had built his plan around the assumption that she would find it eventually, and he needed to appear to find it first. She thought about his directness, his patience, the uncomplicated quality of his interest in her. She went back through every interaction with a new lens. She looked at each one the way you look at an image that contains something hidden, not changing what you see, but changing how you see it. The figure-ground relationship inverting with a slowness that was more disturbing than a sudden revelation would have been. Is there something between you and Pierce? He had asked. And she had said no. She thought about what he'd done with that information. If there was nothing between her and Jackson, then Elena was navigable. Elena was a path. If Elena trusted Nathan, Nathan had access to, not systems, not directly, but proximity, knowledge, the texture of the internal dynamics of the company he was trying to destroy. She felt something cold move through her chest. She picked up her phone, went back through her messages with Nathan, every text, every email. She read them with the same methodology she'd applied to the invoice logs, looking for the gaps, the credential voids, the places where the log showed activity but the signature didn't match. She found 3 things. A question he'd asked over lunch about the external audit protocol, framed as intellectual curiosity, which she had answered because she had no reason not to. A comment he'd made about Blackwell's known investment approach, framed as industry knowledge, which she had engaged with because it seemed relevant. And a moment, on a Thursday 2 weeks ago, when she had left her workstation unlocked for 6 minutes while she went to the kitchen, during which Nathan had been the only other person on that section of the floor, and when she had returned, nothing had looked different, and she had not thought about it at all. 6 minutes. She looked at the building access timestamp for that Thursday. She cross-referenced it against the account modification log. The fourth gap, the one she hadn't been able to explain, corresponded to a 6-minute window on a Thursday afternoon, her workstation, her credentials. She sat with that for a long moment. The specific, cold, total quality of understanding something you cannot un-understand. He hadn't just tried to destroy Jackson's company. He had done part of it using her. The monitor hummed. The city moved below. Somewhere in the building, an HVAC unit cycled through its overnight protocol with the indifferent mechanical regularity of something that did not know what it was cooling. Elena Carter put both palms flat on the desk and breathed through her nose, slow and controlled, 4 counts in and 4 counts out. The way you breathe when you need your mind to stay ahead of what your body wants to do, which was shake, or stand up too fast, or feel the specific nauseating combination of violation and stupidity that comes from realizing you were used and didn't see it. She didn't let herself feel it yet. She filed it. The way she filed everything, precisely, completely, with the note that she would return to it when she could afford to. She opened a new document and began typing. She documented everything, every modification, every gap, every timestamp, the destination account, the CCE naming structure, the incorporation date, the 6-minute Thursday window, and what it meant and what it would mean in a forensic examination of her own credentials. She documented it with the understanding that she was building something that was going to be used in a legal process, which meant every word needed to be precise, and every conclusion needed to be supported, and every moment of interpretation needed to be flagged as interpretation rather than fact. She worked until 1:17 a.m. Then she sent the complete document to Hargrove's secure line, copied Jackson, and shut her monitor off. She sat in the dark for 30 seconds. Then she stood, picked up her bag, and walked to the elevator. And as the doors closed and she began to descend, she understood with absolute clarity that whatever was going to happen in the next 48 hours, it was no longer the kind of thing that resolved quietly or professionally or without cost. Nathan Cole had built a trap, and whether he had built it only for Jackson or whether Elena Carter had been part of the design from the beginning, she was standing in the middle of it either way, and the only path out required her to become something she had never been in 3 years of working in that building. Not an assistant, not a chief of staff. The person who took it apart from the elevator doors opened on the lobby at 1:23 a.m., and Elena walked through it without stopping. The marble floors were empty at this hour. The security desk had one guard, a man named Torres, who had worked the overnight shift for 2 years, and who nodded at her with the particular acknowledgement of someone who had seen her leave late enough often enough that it no longer surprised him. She nodded back, pushed through the glass door into the cold. The street hit her immediately. October at 1 in the morning, the specific cold that has teeth in it, that gets into the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there. She stood on the sidewalk for 3 full seconds, not moving, just breathing, feeling the air move in and out of her chest. The document was sent. Hargrove had it. Jackson had it. The forensic team was arriving at 7. 48 hours. She walked to the curb and raised her hand for a cab, and one came, and she got in and gave her address and sat back and closed her eyes, and the city slid past behind her eyelids in amber and dark, and the cab driver had the radio on low, something instrumental, and she rode the 11 blocks home in a state that was not quite sleep and not quite waking and not quite anything she had a name for. She set her alarm for 5:30. She slept 3 hours and 40 minutes. She was at her desk by 6:15. The floor was empty. The monitors glowed in the pre-dawn quiet, and she pulled up the document she'd sent Hargrove and read it from the beginning the way she always read her own work the next morning, looking for the places where exhaustion had softened precision, where she'd stated something as fact that was still interpretation, where the architecture of the argument had a load-bearing assumption she hadn't fully tested. She found 2. She fixed them. She sent the corrected version at 6:41. At 7:03, Hargrove arrived with 2 people Elena didn't recognize, a man and a woman in their late 30s, both carrying laptops and the specific focused quietness of people who did this kind of work regularly, and understood that the first hour of a forensic engagement was not the time for introductions. Marcus and Jin, Hargrove said, outside counsel's cyber team. They've done 4 of these in the past 18 months. They know the protocol. The account modification logs are here, Elena said, pulling up the system. The credential voids are flagged in red. The CCE Holdings destination trace is in the secondary document. The Thursday 6-minute window. She stopped. She had not told Hargrove about the Thursday window yet, about her own credentials. Hargrove looked at her. What about it? The 4th modification used my workstation, my credentials, while I was away from my desk. A pause. Marcus and Jin exchanged a look that was professional and brief. That's important, Hargrove said carefully. I know what it is, Elena said. Document it accurately. All of it. If we're building a case, the case has to include everything, even the parts that are uncomfortable. Hargrove nodded once, with the specific respect of a lawyer who has just recalibrated her assessment of the person in front of her. We'll need your workstation access log, Jin said. First word she'd spoken. Quiet, direct, efficient. Already pulled. Elena slid a folder across the desk. Thursday timestamps, floor access records, the corridor camera coverage times. I pulled what I had authorization for. You'll need building security for the camera footage itself. I'll handle building security, Hargrove said. They went to work. Jackson arrived at 7:30. He came directly to Elena's office, closed the door, and stood on the other side of her desk looking at her with the expression of someone who had also slept approximately 3 hours and was not going to acknowledge it. Hargrove's team is in, he said. Since 7. They're good. He nodded. He was in yesterday's jacket. She noted that without commenting on it. He'd either gone home and come back in the same clothes, or he hadn't gone home. His hair was right. His shirt was fresh. He'd been somewhere with a change of clothes that wasn't his apartment. Probably the private room on 46 that he used when he worked through the night, a room she'd organized the stocking of 18 months ago for exactly the kind of situation where leaving wasn't an option. Nathan comes in at 9, Jackson said. His calendar has a team briefing at 9:30. He needs to attend it. I know. And you need to be normal. She looked at him. I need you to be exactly who you are in every meeting with him today. No tells, no pressure. He cannot know we have anything yet. Jackson's jaw was tight. I know how to conduct myself, Elena. You know how to conduct yourself with people who've done ordinary things? This is different. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not disagreement, but the acknowledgement of a truth he didn't want to sit with. I'll manage it, he said. How long does Hargrove's team need? Marcus said the CCE shell trace could take 6 hours if they get cooperation from the external registrar. Could take longer. The workstation log analysis is faster, maybe 3 hours. And then we have what we need to call Blackwell's team, present the counter-evidence, and establish that the irregularities in the accounts were planted rather than generated by Pierce Global. At which point the audit becomes an asset rather than a liability, because it's the mechanism through which the fraud was exposed. He processed this. She watched him do it. The specific quality of Jackson thinking, which was different from most people thinking, faster, with less visible uncertainty, the conclusion assembling itself from the inputs with an efficiency that could look like coldness if you didn't understand that it was just how his mind moved. And Nathan, he said, Nathan is a legal matter once we have the chain. Hargrove files with the DA's office. We coordinate with Blackwell's team on the fraud disclosure, and it moves through proper process. That's not what I'm asking. She held his gaze. I know what you're asking. The answer is the same. He breathed through his nose. He used your workstation. I know. He came in here and built a relationship with you specifically to Jackson. Her voice was not loud, but it stopped him. I am aware of what he did. I documented it at 1 a.m, and I thought about it for the entire cab ride home. And I made a decision, which is that I am going to be a professional and do this properly. And nothing you say in the next 60 seconds is going to change that. So if you need to be angry somewhere somewhere else. Right now I need you functional. He looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them in that look. Not the professional information transfer of 3 years, and not the managed distance of the past weeks, but something rawer and less categorized. The specific look of two people who are in something together and both know it, and neither is going to say so right now because right now is not the time. "I'll be functional," he said. "Good." She looked back at her screen. "Close the door on your way out." He closed it. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and held them there for 10 seconds. Then she went back to work. Nathan arrived at 9:07. She heard him before she saw him, his voice in the corridor, easy and unhurried, saying something to Peterson that produced a brief laugh. She did not get up. She watched through the glass partition of her office as he moved across the floor, jacket on, coffee cup in hand, the unremarkable handsomeness arranged in its usual expression of attentive calm. He paused at her office door, knocked once on the open frame. She looked up. "Early start," he said. "Always," she said. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, the calibrated beat of someone checking something, and then smiled. "Still on for Thursday?" She had canceled their standing lunch twice this week due to the audit preparation. She had framed both cancellations as scheduling issues. "I'll let you know," she said. He nodded, moved on. She watched him go and felt the cold clarity of someone who has resolved a question they didn't want to have to resolve. She turned back to her screen. Her hands were steady. The 9:30 team briefing ran 40 minutes. Elena attended, Jackson attended. Nathan presented a status update on the Asia-Pacific portfolio development with the composed competence of someone who had prepared carefully and had nothing to hide, which was the most convincing performance she'd seen in a professional context in 3 years, which itself told her something about the depth of preparation that had gone into this entire operation. She watched Jackson through the meeting. He was exactly right. Neutral, direct, asking the questions he would have asked anyway, responding to Nathan's points with the same clipped efficiency he brought to everything. Not cold. He'd learned not to run cold in meetings, one of the changes she'd watched accumulate over the past weeks. But clear. Professional. Giving nothing. She almost admired it. She knew what it was costing him. At 11:47 a.m., Jin knocked on her open office door with Marcus behind her. They both had the contained, precise energy of people who had found something. "Close it," Elena said. Jin closed the door, set her laptop on Elena's desk, turned it to face her. "The CCE Holdings shell chain," Jin said. 2 layers. The outer shell is Cayman registered, as you found. The inner shell is a Delaware LLC registered 14 months ago. She pointed to the screen. The LLC's registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington. The beneficial owner listed on the operating agreement is Nathan Cole, Elena said. Nathan Christopher Cole. Yes. She looked at the screen for a moment. The words were clean and unambiguous in the document. Name, signature, date, the administrative plainness of a legal record that didn't know it was evidence. "And the fund transfers," she said. 3 transfers total. The one you identified from invoice batch 7C. 2 others we found using the same modification pattern. Different invoice batches. Different amounts, same routing destination. Total transferred is $412,000 over 8 weeks. Into CCE Holdings. Into CCE Holdings. Elena sat back. "That's not a lot," she said, "for what he was risking." "No," Marcus said. "It's not." He leaned over and moved the screen slightly, pulling up a secondary document. "Which is why we kept looking. The fund transfers aren't the main event." She looked at the secondary document. It took her 30 seconds to understand what she was looking at. Then she sat forward very slowly. It was a short position, a securities short position opened through a brokerage account registered to a second entity. Not CCE Holdings, a different structure, UK registered, 11 weeks ago. The position was against Pierce Global's parent holding structure. The size of the position was significant enough that a major reputational event, say a fraud finding in a regulatory audit, would generate a payout that made the $400,000 look like a preliminary expense. "How much?" she said. Marcus told her. She was quiet for 3 seconds. "He didn't come here to steal from the company," she said. It wasn't a question. She was saying it to hear herself say it, to feel the shape of it in the room. "He came here to destroy the company's valuation," Jin said. The invoice manipulation was the trigger for the audit. The audit was the mechanism for the fraud finding. The fraud finding tanks the stock. The short position pays out. And then he walks away clean because he's not the one who reported the fraud. Blackwell's team reported it. He's just a VP who got caught in the crossfire. Elena looked at the screen. What's the brokerage account trail? The UK entity? That's going to take longer. Probably another 8 to 12 hours, but the entity name, Jin pulled it up. RCC Capital Partners. Elena looked at the name, RCC. She pulled Nathan's file from the corner of her desk. She'd brought it up this morning, some instinct, and it was still open to the biography page. His mother's maiden name was listed in the international background check portion, required for the executive package, a standard Pierce Global compliance form. Her name was Rose Cole Carmichael. RCC. His mother, Elena said quietly. Marcus and Jin were silent. He registered the brokerage entity in his mother's initials. She looked at the screen. 14 months of planning, 2 shell structures, a curated professional profile, a VP mandate specifically designed to give him account access, and he named the structures after himself and his mother. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. He wanted to be found eventually, after the fact. He wanted someone to see the architecture. Jin said, "Some of them do." Elena looked at her. "In my experience," Jin said without inflection, "some of them want credit for the construction. They build things to be understood in retrospect." Elena thought about Tuesday lunches. The right questions. The ease. The invitation to dinner. She thought about, is there something between you and Pierce? She picked up her phone and called Hargrove. "We have the ownership change," she said. "Get Jackson." The meeting was in Jackson's office on 46, which was the most private space in the building. Hargrove, Marcus, Jin, Jackson, and Elena. The door locked. The floor otherwise empty at midday. Most of the executive staff was in a separate strategy session 2 floors down that Jackson had quietly ensured ran long. Marcus presented the findings in 11 minutes. Clean, sequential, fully documented. Jackson listened without speaking. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on Marcus, and he did not move and he did not speak, and the room felt the quality of his stillness, the way a room feels barometric pressure change. Not visibly, but everywhere. When Marcus finished, Jackson said, "The short position." "Yes," Marcus said. "What's the trigger date? When does it mature?" The position was structured around a 60-day window. It was opened 11 weeks ago. Marcus looked at his notes. The optimal trigger window opens in 9 days. 9 days. Jackson looked at Elena. She said, "He needs the audit finding to land in the next 9 days. After that, the position loses value rapidly, which means he's been moving on a timeline and we've just intersected it." "He knows the audit is happening," Jackson said. "He triggered the audit. He knows exactly where it is in the process." "Does he know we have this?" "No," Elena said. "Not yet." Jackson looked at Hargrove. "How fast can we move to law enforcement? The documentation is sufficient for an emergency filing. I can have it in front of the DA's Financial Crimes Unit this afternoon. They'll want to verify independently before they move, but with the chain we have..." She looked at Marcus and Jin. "I'd say we're looking at 48 to 72 hours before they're ready to act." "And Blackwell's team?" "I'll call them directly," Elena said. "I'll present the counter evidence and the planted audit trigger. If they're operating in good faith, and I believe they are, they'll pull back the fraud allegation and flip the narrative. The audit becomes the mechanism that caught the external scheme." Jackson nodded, slow and deliberate. He was thinking through the shape of the next 72 hours the way she'd watched him think through acquisition structures, mapping every node, every dependency, every point where the sequence could fail. "Nathan needs to stay in the building," he said. "Yes," Hargrove said. "If he leaves the jurisdiction before law enforcement is ready to move, we have a recovery problem. So we keep him here." Jackson's voice was very even. "Acting normal. For 72 hours, Elena said. He looked at her. "And you can do that. Sit in meetings with him for 72 hours. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. Something moved in his face. Not doubt. Recognition. "All right," he said. He looked at the room. "Hargrove, file this afternoon. Marcus, Jin, stay on the RCC Capital Trace. Elena. He paused. Are you all right? The question landed differently than it might have. Different from the way it would have landed from anyone else, and different from anything he'd said in 3 years of working in the same building. She looked at him for a moment. Ask me in 72 hours, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. All right, he said again. Let's go. The next 20 hours were the kind of hours that don't feel like hours. They feel like a single continuous state of sustained pressure, the kind that flattens time into a texture rather than a sequence. Elena moved through the building with the same precise efficiency she always had. She attended 2 meetings that included Nathan. She answered his questions. She responded to a message from him at 3:14 that referenced the Thursday dinner, saying, "Still hoping you'll say yes." She wrote back, "This week is impossible. Rain check." He responded with a single word, "Of course." And she sat with the screen for a moment looking at that word and then closed the message and moved on. At 6 p.m., Hargrove confirmed the DA's Financial Crimes Unit had accepted the filing. The assigned investigator had requested a meeting for the following morning. At 8 p.m., Marcus sent a 3-line message. RCC Capital Partners. Beneficial ownership confirmed. Nathan Christopher Cole. Documentation attached. At 9:40, Elena called Blackwell's team. She had prepared for the call for 40 minutes. She knew the shape of it, the argument she needed to make, the evidence she needed to present, the specific sequence that would move a skeptical external audit team from adversarial to cooperative. She had done this kind of persuasion work before, in different contexts, different stakes. She knew the technique. She had not previously done it while running on 5 hours of sleep across 2 days with the knowledge that the man she was building a case against had spent 12 weeks constructing a relationship with her as part of an operational strategy. She did it anyway. Richard Blackwell's lead auditor was a man named Park. He was skeptical for the first 8 minutes. He was less skeptical for the next 6. He was quiet for 2 minutes after she finished. Then he said, "Send me the documentation." She sent it. Park called back at 11:04 p.m. "We're going to need a day to verify independently, but if this holds, it holds," she said. "If it holds," he said, "then the audit becomes a fraud referral rather than a compliance finding. That's a very different outcome for Pierce Global." "Yes," she said. "It is." She hung up. She sat back in her chair and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then she heard footsteps. Specific footsteps. She dropped her hands. Jackson was in the doorway. It was past 11, and the floor was empty, and he was standing there with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the expression of someone who had heard enough of the call to know how it had gone. "Park," he said, "he'll verify independently. He'll be done by tomorrow evening." Jackson leaned against the doorframe. He looked like what he was. A man who had been in sustained operational crisis for 2 days and was holding it together through will and practice and nothing else. His hair was slightly off. His eyes were tired in a way they almost never were. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a person rather than a performance. "We're going to make it," he said. It wasn't triumph, just statement, the specific tone of someone confirming a calculation. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Then, "Elena." She looked at him. "The message I sent you, Thursday night." He stopped, started again. "I need to finish." Her phone buzzed. She looked down reflexively. The screen showed a name, Nathan Cole. She looked at the message. It was 4 words and they turned the temperature of the room approximately 10 degrees. "I know you know." She held the phone. Her heartbeat was in her throat. Jackson crossed the room in 4 steps and looked at the screen. She watched his face go absolutely still. Not the processing stillness, not the managed stillness, but the stillness of someone whose body has responded to a threat signal before the mind has fully caught up. "He knows," Jackson said. "Jackson, someone told him." Her voice was even. She was surprised by how even it was. "Or he has a monitor on the system access logs and he saw the forensic queries. Which means he's going to move." She was already standing. "He's going to try to trigger the audit finding before we can present the counter evidence to Blackwell. He needs the fraud finding on record. Even if it's later disputed, even if the case against him is solid, a recorded fraud finding creates a news event, and the news event moves the stock before the correction can catch up. She grabbed her phone. He doesn't need the case against him to go away. He just needs one news cycle. Jackson said, "How does he trigger it?" "He goes to Blackwell directly, tonight, before we can reach Park again. He tells them Pierce Global is trying to suppress the audit finding and manufacture a counter-narrative. If Blackwell puts anything on record tonight, Park said he'd need until tomorrow evening to verify." That was before Nathan knew we had him. She looked at Jackson. "If Nathan calls Park tonight with a counter-story, Park doesn't run the audit. He pauses. And while Park pauses, Nathan gets to someone in the press," Jackson said, "or files something himself. In his name, not Blackwell's. A whistleblower report. It's less clean, but it still creates the news cycle." They looked at each other across the office. The floor was empty around them. The building breathed its overnight HVAC rhythm. "Call Hargrove," he said. She was already dialing. Hargrove answered on the second ring. Elena gave her 30 seconds of information. Hargrove said, "I'll call the DA's investigator. Emergency contact. We may be able to get an overnight restraining order on any public disclosure, but I need an hour." "You have 40 minutes, Elena said. She ended the call. Her phone buzzed again. Nathan. This time it wasn't a text. It was a call. She looked at the screen, looked at Jackson. "Answer it," he said. She answered it. Nathan's voice was different than she'd ever heard it. Not the easy, unhurried quality of the Tuesday lunches, not composed, not performing, just direct, stripped of everything she'd known it to carry. "You're smarter than I planned for," he said. She said nothing. "I want you to know that wasn't personal. What happened with your workstation? I want you to know—" "Don't," she said. A pause. "I'm going to make a call in the next 30 minutes, he said. "You know what call." "I know." "You can't stop it legally in 30 minutes. "We'll see." "Elena," his voice dropped slightly, "I'm not asking you to let me go. I'm telling you the timeline so you can try. Because you deserve that. What I did was—" "Don't finish that sentence." Her voice was cold and clear and entirely steady. "Not to me, not tonight." Silence. 30 minutes, he said, and hung up. She lowered the phone. The room was very still. Jackson was watching her with the particular attention of someone who is trying to read a situation from a person's face because the situation is moving faster than the available information. 30 minutes, she said. Hargrove needs 40. "I know." She was already moving. "There's another way to buy 10 minutes. "How?" She looked at him. The full weight of what she was about to say sat in her chest for 1 second before she let it go. "You call Blackwell directly," she said. "Not Park. Richard Blackwell himself. You have his number. You've had 3 prior engagements with his team. You call him right now and you tell him personally that a counter-narrative is about to be delivered to his team and you need him to hold all disclosures for 1 hour pending a direct conversation. He doesn't know you. He knows your company. He might hold. He might not." "No," she said. "He might not." Jackson looked at her. The city moved below them, 45 floors down, indifferent and continuous. "And if he doesn't hold," Jackson said quietly, "and the news cycle starts tonight, then we fight it," she said, "with what we have. We get the forensic chain in front of every financial outlet that runs the initial story. We have Marcus and Jen on record. We have the DA filing. We fight it the same way we've been fighting everything else in this building for the past 3. Jackson made the call standing in the middle of her office with his phone against his ear and his eyes on the window, and Elena standing 3 feet away watching him with the specific stillness of someone who has done everything they can do and is now entirely dependent on something outside their control. It rang 4 times. 5. She counted them. 6. Then, a voice. Older, measured, the voice of a man who answered late calls without alarm because late calls were a feature of the life he'd built. "Pierce," Richard Blackwell said. Not a question, not surprised, just the name, acknowledged. "Blackwell." Jackson's voice was completely level. Not performed level. Actually, level, in the way Elena had watched him become over the past weeks. The way a person sounds when they've stopped managing themselves for an audience and are simply speaking. I need 1 hour from your team. No disclosures, no filings, no contact with any external parties. 1 hour. A pause. That's a significant ask at 11:40 p.m., Blackwell said. I know what time it is. Another pause. She heard Blackwell breathing, slow, deliberate, the breath of someone making a calculation. You're going to tell me why, Blackwell said. In the morning, fully. Everything we have. And we have enough that you'll want to hear it before anything lands on record. Jackson paused once. Just once. Richard, I am asking you personally. 1 hour. The silence that followed lasted 9 seconds. Elena counted those too. 1 hour, Blackwell said. My team does nothing for 1 hour. After that, I can't hold them. That's all I need. Blackwell ended the call. Jackson lowered the phone. He turned from the window and looked at Elena, and she was already dialing Hargrove. We have 1 hour, she said when Hargrove picked up. What do you need? Hargrove said, I need 35 minutes and for you to not call me again until I call you. Done. She hung up. The office was quiet around them. 45 floors of glass and walnut and marble, in the accumulated architecture of a company built by one man from a leased office and 3 employees and the specific kind of will that doesn't recognize when it's supposed to stop. Jackson sat down in the chair across from her desk. Not his chair, the visitor chair, the one that clients and directors used, the one that put him on the same side of the desk as everyone else. He sat in it with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Elena sat at her desk. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence had a quality to it that was different from the operational silences of the past 72 hours. Not the silence of 2 people managing a crisis, but the silence of 2 people who have been in a sustained emergency together and have arrived temporarily at a pocket of stillness and don't know yet what to do with it. You should call Sophie, Jackson said. He was still looking at the floor. She looked at him. What? Your sister. He glanced up. You haven't called her since Monday, I noticed. Elena held that for a moment. The specific, strange tenderness of being noticed in a particular way by someone who spent 3 years not noticing. I'll call her tomorrow, she said. He nodded. Jackson. She waited until he looked at her fully. The message. Thursday night. Something shifted in his face. The tiredness in it went a layer deeper. Not more tired, but more honest about what the tiredness was. I sent it by accident, he said. Or not by accident. I sent it before I finished it because I knew if I finished it, I would decide not to send it. So send it now, she said. Finish it now. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the middle distance, not away from her, just past the immediate surface of the room, the way people look when they're finding words in a place they don't usually go for words. I've been in love with you, he said, since the Hong Kong restructure. 18 months ago. I watched you work for 36 hours straight and make 3 decisions that saved the company from a liability that no one else in the building even understood was there, and I sat in that conference room afterward looking at you and understood something I immediately did everything I could to not understand. She didn't speak. I turned it into pressure, he said. The way I do everything I don't know how to hold, I turned it into more demands, more expectations, more of you in that building because that was the only way I knew to be near something I wanted without acknowledging that I wanted it. He stopped. His hands were clasped in front of him, forearms on his knees. What I did to you, the way I ran that office, the way I treated you, the ultimatum, that wasn't about the company. The company was the excuse. I was afraid of what happened when you weren't there, and I made that your problem. And it was the most dishonorable thing I've done in a life that has had some genuinely dishonorable moments. The room was very quiet. That's a sentence, he said. That's what I couldn't finish. Elena looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she looked at documents that required precision. Not quickly, not with the fast processing skim of someone seeking the essential information, but slowly, with the attention that takes in everything including what isn't stated. She saw a man who was 41 years old and had built an empire and run it with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided at some point that control was the same as safety and who had arrived in a visitor chair at 11:47 p.m. on the 45th floor of his own building, having spent the last month learning at considerable cost what the difference was. I know, she said. That's not... I know what I feel, she said. I've known for a while. I've been not saying it for the same reasons you were not sending the sentence. She paused. But I need you to understand something, Jackson. What you did, the 3 years of it, and not just the ultimatum, all of it, I'm not going to carry that quietly. If we do this, whatever this is, I'm going to tell you when something is wrong. I'm going to leave a room when I need to leave a room. I am never going to make myself smaller to make you more comfortable. And if that produces friction, I want the friction, he said. Elena, I have been in rooms my entire life where no one pushed back. I built it that way deliberately. I was wrong. She looked at him. I know you were, she said. Her phone rang. Hargrove. She answered it. It's done, Hargrove said. Her voice had the compressed satisfaction of someone who has sprinted a distance they weren't sure they could sprint. Emergency order is filed. Any public disclosure from Nathan Cole pertaining to Pierce Global financial records is legally prohibited pending the DA investigation, which is now officially open as of 11:52 p.m. The investigator fast-tracked the filing based on the documentation package. Cole cannot go to the press, cannot file a whistleblower report, cannot contact Blackwell's team outside the investigation protocol. Elena closed her eyes for 1 second. Thank you, Hargrove. Park from Blackwell's team will call you at 8 a.m. I already sent him the forensic package. He'll have his verification done by noon. Good. Nathan Cole is going to need a lawyer, Hargrove said. That's not our problem anymore. No, Elena said. It's not. She hung up. She looked at Jackson. It's done, she said. He let out a breath, long and slow and from somewhere deep. The specific exhale of someone releasing a pressure they'd been holding so long they'd stopped tracking it. For a moment he just sat there. And she just sat there. And the city moved 45 floors below them, entirely indifferent, entirely continuous, doing what cities do, persisting, without awareness of what had just been decided above it. That's Nathan Cole was met at the building entrance the following morning at 8:14 by 2 investigators from the DA's Financial Crimes Unit. Elena knew this because Torres at the security desk sent her a message at 8:16 that said simply, "It happened." She read it at her desk and set the phone down and sat with it for 30 seconds. Then she opened her work queue and went to the next thing. The meeting with Park from Blackwell's team was at noon, as Hargrove had promised. Elena attended with Jackson, Hargrove, and Birch. Park was methodical and thorough and had clearly spent the morning going through the forensic package with the attention of someone who understood exactly what it meant for his team's prior audit framing. He arrived at the meeting with a folder of his own documentation and spent 20 minutes laying out his independent verification, which confirmed every element of the evidence chain Elena had built. At the end of his presentation, he closed the folder and looked at Jackson and said, "The audit finding is officially reclassified. Pierce Global is not the subject of fraud. Pierce Global is the victim of a coordinated external scheme that used internal access to plant fraudulent records. Our team will file accordingly with the regulatory body and will issue a corrective statement to any parties who receive preliminary notification." Jackson said, "I appreciate your team's diligence." Park looked at him for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he looked at Elena. The forensic documentation was exceptional. The timestamp analysis alone, he stopped. It was exceptional work. "Thank you," Elena said. Park left. Birch left. Hargrove stayed briefly to review next steps, and then she left. Jackson and Elena were alone in the conference room. The afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle. October doing what October did. The particular quality of late-season light that turns everything slightly amber, slightly long-shadowed. It sat on the table between them and on the floor and on the far wall in bars and made the room feel quieter than it was. "It's over," Jackson said. "The Nathan part is over," Elena said. "The company still has work to do. The Asia-Pacific mandate needs to be rebuilt from legitimate groundwork. The preliminary accounts need to be audited internally. There's a regulatory disclosure timeline that Hargrove's going to manage. It's not nothing." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it's nothing." She nodded. "Elena." He was still looking at her with the directness she'd watched him develop. Not the old directness, which was the directness of someone moving things out of his way, but something different, something that included the person it was aimed at. I want to restructure the company. She waited. Not operationally, that's already happening. I mean, the governance structure, the power distribution. He set his hands flat on the table. There are no checks on me in this building. I built it that way. And I thought it was efficiency, and I understand now that it was something else. I want a board with actual authority. I want the chief of staff role to have formal governance standing, not just operational authority, but the ability to escalate concerns to the board independent of me. She looked at him. You want to check on yourself. I want a structure that doesn't depend on people being afraid of me to function, because that's what I had for 3 years, and look at what it produced. A company where a man like Nathan Cole could walk in and find exactly the vulnerabilities he needed because the vulnerabilities were built into the culture. She was quiet for a moment. The light moved slightly as a cloud passed outside. That's the right instinct, she said. It'll take time to build correctly. I know. I want you to build it. As chief of staff. As whatever you need to be called to have the authority to do it properly. He paused. Equal executive partner in operations. That's what I said when I asked you to come back. I meant it. I want it documented, formalized, not dependent on my goodwill. She looked at him. You're documenting against yourself. Yes, he said. That's the point. She held the weight of that. The specific weight of a person who has arrived at something they didn't have before, not the absence of ego, which was neither possible nor interesting, but something rarer, a genuine reckoning with what the ego had cost, and a willingness to build the corrective into the architecture. All right, she said. All right, you'll do it? Or all right, you're considering it? All right, I'll do it, she said. He exhaled. Something in him settled, visible, like a shift in the way he was sitting, a fraction of the held tension releasing. And the other thing, he said, the personal thing. I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen. I'm not asking you to. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I know how to run a company. I know how to build things. He gestured slightly between them, a gesture that was more expressive than most of what she'd ever seen him do with his hands. I don't have a template for this. Neither do I, she said. I've spent 3 years as your assistant. The entire framework of how I know you is built on a structure that doesn't work anymore. So we build a different one. We build a different one, she said, slowly, with actual communication, which means if something is wrong, I tell you, and you don't respond to it with pressure or demands. You respond to it like a person. I can do that. You can try, she said. I've watched you try for the past 6 weeks, and you've been better than I expected. That counts for something. He almost smiled again. This time it went slightly further. Not a full smile, because Jackson Pierce at full smile was still something she had not witnessed and suspected was an event of some rarity, but further than almost. That might be the best review I've ever received, he said. Don't let it go to your head. Too late, he said. She looked at him across the table and felt the thing she'd been carefully not naming for 6 weeks settle into something she could see clearly. It was not simple. Nothing about it was simple, and it wasn't supposed to be. It had the specific complexity of something that had been built over time and through friction and at cost, and which would require continued work to maintain. She understood that. She was not afraid of work. She recognized, sitting in a conference room at 12:40 in the afternoon with a man she had once considered her antagonist and was now considering something else entirely, and the only appropriate response to the absurdity and the accuracy of this situation was to let it be both things simultaneously. Go do your afternoon, she said. I have a governance framework to start drafting. He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Tonight, he said. Not the building. Somewhere else. Dinner. She looked at him. Are you asking or scheduling? Asking, he said. Deliberate, clear. Then yes, she said. Tonight. He left. She sat alone in the conference room for a moment. The light had shifted while they were talking, moved across the table, reached the far edge, begun its slow withdrawal. She watched it. Then she picked up her phone and called Sophie. Her sister answered on the first ring, the way she always did when Elena called after a gap, with the particular warmth of someone who had learned not to count the gaps but to receive the call when it came. Elle, you okay? I'm okay, Elena said. You sound different. I've had a week. Sophie laughed. Tell me. So she did. Not all of it. Not the forensics and the shell companies and the 30-minute countdown, but the shape of it. The thing with Nathan and what it had cost her and what she'd built in the middle of it. And Jackson. She told Sophie about Jackson with the specific difficulty of trying to describe something you're still inside of, still assembling, still not sure has the shape you think it has. Sophie was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then she said, "You sound like you came through something." "I did," Elena said. "Good." And then softer. "I'm proud of you. You know that?" Elena pressed her palm flat against the table, felt the grain of it under her hand, the solidity. "Yeah," she said. "I know." The governance restructure took 4 months. Elena drafted the framework in the first 2 weeks, working with Hargrove and an external governance consultant who specialized in corporate restructuring for closely held companies. She presented it to Jackson in its entirety before it went to the board, and he read every page, and he marked 3 sections for discussion, and they discussed them, actually discussed them, with the friction she'd promised and the response she'd asked for, and arrived at something better than what either of them had proposed separately. The board was expanded, 3 independent directors were added, with genuine oversight authority and a direct reporting relationship to the governance committee that Elena chaired. The chief of staff role was formally codified with escalation rights independent of the CEO. Jackson's direct authority over operational decisions above a certain threshold now required sign-off from 2 executive partners, one of whom was Elena. At the board meeting where the restructured governance was formally ratified, one of the new independent directors, a woman named Chen, who had a reputation for asking the questions no one wanted to hear, looked at Jackson across the table and said, "You built these constraints yourself." "Yes," Jackson said. "Why?" He looked at her, then, briefly, at Elena, then back. "Because the company I want to run can't be built on the one I had, and the person I want to be can't exist inside the structure I built. So I changed the structure." Chen looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something on the document in front of her and said, "Ratified." The criminal case against Nathan Cole moved through the process with the particular slowness of legal machinery that is thorough because it has to be, not because anyone is in a hurry. He was formally charged 8 weeks after the night of the 30-minute countdown. The charges included securities fraud, wire fraud, and unauthorized access to protected financial systems. His lawyer filed 3 motions in the first month. All 3 were denied. The DA's Financial Crimes Unit presented the evidence chain that Elena had built, along with Marcus and Jin's forensic verification, and the thing held the way things hold when they've been built correctly. Nathan Cole did not testify. He took a plea agreement 6 months after the charges were filed. Elena was not in the courtroom. She had given her deposition 3 months earlier in a conference room at Hargrove's firm, and had answered every question with the precision she brought to everything and had not looked away from any of it, including the Thursday 6-minute window, which she described in complete detail with the understanding that honesty in a legal proceeding is not the same as self-damage, that being used was not the same as participating. Hargrove told her afterward, "You were the best deposition I've ever managed." "I just told the truth," Elena said. "That's what made it the best," Hargrove said. Bottom. She and Jackson did not make the relationship public inside the company for 3 months. Not from concealment, from the same principles she had applied to everything since coming back. It needed to be built correctly, on a foundation that wasn't contingent on the crisis that had created the conditions for it. They had dinner 3 times in the first week, which was perhaps more than strictly calibrated, and which she chose not to calibrate because calibration had been her operating mode for 3 years, and she was done with it. He was different outside the building. She had expected this in theory and was still surprised by it in practice. The way a context can contain a person so completely that removing it reveals someone partially unfamiliar. He was quieter. He paid attention to things she mentioned without noting that she'd mentioned them, and returned to them later, which was such a particular and specific form of being heard that the first time it happened, she sat with it for a full day afterward. The way you sit with something you haven't felt in long enough that feeling it again requires adjustment. He learned to say when something was wrong without making the wrongness her problem to manage. This was slower, and it required more of the friction she'd promised, and there were 2 nights in the first month where the conversation went to the edge of something difficult and came back from it not because it resolved cleanly, but because they both chose to stay at the table. She learned to stay at the table. That was her own work. The specific internal work of someone who has practiced leaving, who has built the leaving reflex as a survival mechanism, learning to distinguish between the situations where leaving is the right answer and the situations where it's just the familiar one. She found the distinction harder to draw than she'd expected. She drew it anyway. The company celebration was in late April, on a rooftop terrace that Pierce Global used for external events. It was not a company party in the traditional sense. Jackson didn't do traditional company parties, and Elena had not suggested he start. It was a dinner for 60 people, the full executive team, the board, the external partners who had worked with the company during the restructure, and Hargrove, who arrived with her husband and was the only person in the room who knew the full sequence of what the past 6 months had contained. Elena wore a dress that was not her work uniform. This sounds like a small thing, and was not. It was the dress she'd bought in November, in a shop she'd walked into on a Saturday afternoon when she had nowhere in particular to be, which still happens sometimes with the slight foreignness of a sensation you haven't fully integrated. Jackson found her on the terrace before dinner, standing at the railing looking at the city. He stood beside her. He did not touch her yet. He had learned the geometry of when to move toward and when to stand at the right distance, and this was the kind of moment where the distance was part of the thing. They stood and looked at the city. "I've been thinking about what I'm going to say tonight," he said. "The remarks. To the team." "What are you going to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to talk about resilience, about what the company came through and what it built on the other side. Standard stuff. But I think the thing I actually want to say is simpler than that." He looked at the city. The April evening was mild enough that you could stand outside without a coat if you stood still. "I want to say that a company is made of people, and the quality of the company is determined by whether those people are seen, and that I spent a long time building something that was very good at not seeing people." He paused, "And that I was wrong, and that it cost things it shouldn't have cost, and that the company we're building now is built on a different premise." She turned and looked at him. "Say that," she said. "Say exactly that." He turned and looked at her. The terrace lights were low and warm, and the city was doing its nighttime arrangement behind him. He looked like what he was, a man who had built something and broken something and built something better on the break, which is not a story about triumph. It's just the honest story of what some people manage to do if they stay in it long enough to find out who they are when the structure comes down. Elena. He said her name the way he'd said it in that elevator corridor 6 months ago. Not managed, not controlled, just her name. "I know," she said. "I haven't proposed yet." "I know you haven't." "I'm going to." "I know that too," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a ring. Not a box, just the ring, the way someone carries something they've been carrying for a while. Not waiting for the right setting, but for the right moment, which turns out to be a Tuesday in November, or a Thursday in March, or an April evening on a terrace while the city lays itself out below like an argument for everything that's still possible. The ring was simple. She noticed that. He had noticed that she didn't wear ornate things. He held it in his palm and looked at her and said, "I'm not asking you as your employer. I'm not asking because of what you did for the company. I'm asking because you are the only person in my life who has ever told me the truth when the truth was something I didn't want to hear, and I spent 3 years punishing you for it. And then you came back anyway and told me again. And I don't have a language for what that means to me, except to say that I want to spend whatever time I have left learning to deserve it." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about a morning in October when she packed her personal items in a bag and walked to an elevator and heard her own heartbeat and discovered, midair, that she was not as afraid of falling as she'd thought. She took the ring. She put it on. "You're going to have to keep working at it," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean that. I'm not going to let you stop." "I know," he said again. And the third time he said it, it had the same accumulating weight as the first night in her office, when he'd said it 3 times in the space of a minute, but different. Not the weight of acknowledging what he'd done wrong, but the weight of someone who has arrived at a specific and genuine understanding of what he is saying yes to, and is saying it anyway, and means it completely. She stepped forward and he put his arms around her and she felt his breathing against her hair. Slow. A little uneven. The breathing of a man who does not often allow himself to be held in anything and is learning, at 41, that this is not a weakness but the exact opposite. Behind them, through the terrace doors, the dinner was beginning. 60 people. The company they were building, the structure they had written together in the margins of a crisis that could have destroyed everything and instead had exposed the load-bearing truth of it. In a few minutes, they would go inside. He would give his remarks. She would sit at the table where she had a chair, not as an assistant, not as a staff member, but as a partner. In the company, in the governance structure, in the conversation that didn't have a clean ending because it wasn't supposed to. Life doesn't end. It continues, and then it continues again. And the work of it is not the resolution, but the willingness to stay inside it and keep building. But right now they stood on the terrace. The city spread below them in its million-lit windows, each one a different arrangement of what people do with the time they have, and Elena Carter stood inside the arms of a man she had once walked away from and came back to and chose again, and looked out at all of it, and felt not the managed peace of someone who has suppressed the difficult things, but the actual, hard-won, imperfect peace of someone who has gone through the difficult things and is still standing. Still here, still choosing. That was enough. That was, she understood now, precisely enough.